Bodies are not easy to draw. Maybe you're just getting started with them and you want to figure out the quickest way to learn. Or maybe you already have some experience, but you want to make your bodies look more realistic and dynamic. Either way, I'll take you through all the steps you need to go from this to this. So let's get started. Like most people, when I first started drawing, I started with the head and face. And at some point, I decided I wanted to draw a body to go along with it. So it looked a little something like this. Yeah, that's not great. What can I do? I needed to figure out a quick and easy way to get to drawing at least passable looking bodies. So this is what I figured out. I like to start with an oval shape for the head, but make sure to add a bit to the back to make sure there's enough room for the brain. I also like drawing a cross in to indicate where the face is going to be. Then let's draw a line for the neck and connect it with an oval for the torso and this upside down triangular shape for the hips. Then I can join these shapes together. I find it really helpful to add a center line so I can figure out where the middle of these forms are. From here, I can add some circles for the shoulders and then a curved line to indicate where the collarbone is. I find it super helpful to draw the shoulders in separately because it reminds me that the shoulders are a lot more mobile than expected. Just look at how much they can move. For the arms and legs, first I like to sketch out the rough poses with some light lines. And then when I'm happy with it, then I can thicken out the neck and limbs with some parallel lines. And this is already good enough to serve as guidelines for a basic body. Trace over the lines, erase the unneeded guidelines, and we'll end up with something like this. At this point, you can also add some extra details if you want, for example, the collarbone and maybe even some chest definition and the belly button. And here is the final result. It's relatively simple, but I think it's a pretty good start. However, even if you follow this step by step, it's not foolproof. Firstly, an important thing to remember is that not all artists like to use these specific shapes. Right now we have these squishy ovals or even bean shapes, but some people prefer using box shapes. The hips or the pelvis is kind of weird. I've used a box shape in the past, but I've seen others use a bucket or even a bowl shape. But which one is best? The answer is there's no best one. Each approach has different strengths and weaknesses. The bean is easy to get started with since you don't have to be as precise with your perspective drawing. The boxes, on the other hand, allow you to see the orientation of the rib cage and the pelvis more easily. This is particularly important when you're drawing poses where the body is twisting. But whatever method you end up choosing, it can still end up looking kind of off. Uh-oh, how can we fix this? So I think there's one main reason why things look wrong or off, which is that the proportions are not accurate. Luckily, there are two easy ways to make sure your proportions are correct. The first is to basically measure. And I don't mean with the ruler, I mean with heads. This method was popularized by Andrew Loomis, who figured out that if you use the head as a measuring unit, you can figure out where the various landmarks of the human body are. For example, measuring from the bottom, for an ideal figure that is 8 heads tall, you'll find at the bottom of the knees are 2 heads up, and the belly button is 5 heads up, and so on. This works really well, and artists have been using this technique for ages, but honestly, I find that it can be a bit of a headache to keep in mind all the time. Not to mention, this doesn't even always work. 8 heads is convenient, but humans come in all shapes and sizes, as Loomis himself demonstrates here. The problems become particularly evident when we try to draw more stylized characters. Check this out. That doesn't look quite right, does it? A stylized character might have larger or smaller heads than reality, so we might need a more flexible approach to proportions. So the second approach is what I personally use more often, simply comparing certain landmarks with other ones. Here are some examples. The crotch, or the bottom of the pelvis, is halfway down the entire body. If the arms are in a resting state, the wrists will also be at about that point. The joints, as previously mentioned, are about halfway down the actual limbs. As for the elbows, they're somewhere between the ribcage and pelvis at the waist. As for hand and feet sizes, it can vary a bit. A general rule of thumb is to have the hand be about the size of your character's face. However, if in doubt, it's usually better to make the hands too big rather than too small. Small hands will almost always look awkward, but big hands can be really expressive. The flexibility of this approach also lets me draw more interesting and stylized bodies. Checking these simple landmarks every time you draw a body can make it fairly easy to keep things proportional. Personally, I use a combination of both methods to check my proportions. And here's a tip to help you get it right. Go from big shapes to small shapes. It maybe sounds obvious to mention this, but the most important measurements are the big ones. It doesn't matter how much detail you add if the character's arms are too short. However, even if you do get them all right, it doesn't mean that's the only thing that can go wrong. Sometimes the body just looks really stiff. which is where gesture comes in. These are gesture drawings. Timed gesture drawing is probably the most important practice you can do if you want to be able to portray bodies, either realistic or stylized. It's best to do it in person, but you can also do it online with tools like Line of Action. It shows you a bunch of reference photos in various poses, from anywhere between 30 seconds to 10 minutes. I think 1-minute poses is a good place to start. And you might be thinking, wait, just 1 minute? How is that enough time to draw an entire body? Even just drawing the head takes longer than that. But what's important to know is that the goal of these drawings is not to draw every single detail you can see, but to capture the movement, energy, and essence of a pose. By limiting the time, it forces you to think about which lines are the most important to properly depict the figure. But even knowing all that, my first gesture drawings looked like this. It takes practice before you're able to express an entire figure in just 60 seconds. You'll find that with every drawing you attempt, you'll gradually be able to add more and more to it. So don't get discouraged, because with just proportion and gesture, we'll be able to draw fun, dynamic bodies for your characters. But this isn't the whole story. You could take this much further, because while these figures are fun, they're kind of simple. How can we make it more realistic? Well, the answer to this, of course, is anatomy, right? Anatomy is the study of the human body. It's understanding what bones make up a skeleton, which muscles are attached to those bones, what those muscles do, and all sorts of other things as well. And here's the key thing to know about anatomy, which is that you don't need it. Hang on, how does that make any sense? Bodies are made of muscle and bone. So if you want to draw bodies, you'll need to learn about those muscles and bones, right? So when I first started learning how to draw bodies, I Googled anatomy to find some resources to learn it, and was met with this. Whoa, that's a lot. But I want to draw bodies, so I started to slowly memorize everything I could about anatomy. But what I didn't know is that I didn't have to do this. Let me explain. Anatomy is obviously a great thing to learn. Knowing all these details is great if you want to draw more detailed and realistic bodies. But even with that much anatomical knowledge, you can end up with something like this. And the way I achieve this is by using mannequins, and I don't mean this thing. See, my problem is that I can't actually remember every single anatomical detail. There's just way too much. I can't use what I can't remember. Instead, I try to simplify the human body into shapes I actually can memorize. Let me show you the mannequin that I personally like to use. I prefer to draw the ribcage and back muscles as a combined form, as kind of a squishy rectangle with rounded corners. At this point, I can also add some breasts if needed. The pelvis, however, has always been kind of tricky for me. For now, I like to draw it as this kind of messed up cylinder of sorts. The edges of the cylinder line up with the curves of the iliac crest. Oh, can you find a picture of the iliac crest? Okay, cool, thanks. An important detail to remember while you're drawing this is that the chest and pelvis is attached to the spine. The S-shaped curve of the spine means that the torso tends to tilt backwards, while the pelvis tilts forward. Getting this curve right is an important part of making the bodies feel more natural and less stiff. And now it's time to draw the arms and legs again. We use the same spears for the shoulders and connect them up with a curved line for the collarbone. But we can also make sure that this line dips a bit in the middle, just like a real collarbone. Then we can sketch out the rest of the limbs using cylinders and spheres for the joints, though remember we still have to keep the proportions in mind. I also find it really helpful to draw in contour lines to figure out which direction the limbs are going in. And after all that, here's where we're at. But we're just getting started. Now here's where studying anatomy becomes useful, but wait. Not all that at once, just a bit at a time. For example, we might learn that there tends to be less muscle and fat around joints, so we might make the joints a little thinner, like this. In particular, the wrist. We can also try sketching in some major muscle groups, for example, the pectoral muscles. I also really like drawing in the shoulder muscles, or deltoids as well. They have an almost boxy shape on top. However, I have to confess that there's something I wasn't entirely truthful about. When explaining the mannequin, I drew it in a very structured step-by-step way. But when I actually draw, it looks more like this. It is way more messy. Instead of drawing the forms from top to bottom, I prefer to start with a loose gestural sketch to make sure that the pose feels natural. So I lightly sketch in some limbs and, wait, you know what? I don't like this. I'm gonna start again. Maybe it'll be safer to start with something simpler. Okay, once again, I'll start with a gesture to figure out the overall pose first. Hang on, I don't think I like this either. Let me just erase and try again. One more time? Hang on, this isn't great either. Unfortunately, I'll have to do a lot of erasing, undoing, and a ton of trial and error. How can I prevent this? The answer is, I don't. This is just how I draw. I think it's normal. For me, art is a very iterative process, especially if I'm not using a reference. My ability to visualize is actually really weak, so in order to figure out if something looks good, I actually have to draw it to find out. And remember, using reference is also really helpful. It's always an option and never a bad idea. Anyway, when I finish the mannequin, I can use it as a foundation and start layering some muscles on top. But of course, it's also completely fine to keep things simple. This is the really cool part about learning anatomy. There's a lot to remember, but as you gradually learn more and more, you can add it to your bodies. That means you can still enjoy drawing bodies for your characters before you spend a ton of time studying. And this video has only barely scratched the surface. There's a ton of things I haven't covered, such as different body types. Remember that every single body is a little different. But the most important thing about drawing bodies is to have fun. And by the way, if you enjoyed the video, memberships are now available on my channel. I work really hard on these videos, so if you want to support me, please consider checking them out. I can't offer much because I want to keep making sure that my efforts are available to everyone, but as a thank you, I do have full time lapses for my illustrations available to members. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye. Dude, that wave looks so scuffed.